Okay, Matthew 24. This is the third week in a row that we're in this chapter. We're going to be finishing up the predictive portion of the Olivet Discourse this morning. And so if you haven't been here for the last couple of weeks, then I don't know, like bear with me because I'm going to make some assumptions and not re-explain some of the things that are going to go up on the slides. But if you're interested in how we came to some of these conclusions, then I would encourage you to listen to the audio. It is available on a shared Google Drive, and we have a link to that if you need it. But the main topic this morning is getting ready for the climax of human history. And so the things that we're talking about, the things that we're considering as we continue to press into this discussion that Jesus is having, have covered a couple of different points. And so we've already seen that Jesus taught that human history is headed toward a massive climax. So he's referred to this time as the Great Tribulation, and he gave us a series of signs that he refers to as the signs of the times. And he says that if you can tell that the seasons are getting ready to change, then you should be able to discern these signs of the times. And so these signs are listed in this conversation, and we've looked at a few of them already. We're going to try and close out that list this morning. And so we're also going to consider another passage that was written a little bit later than this one by one of the guys that's sitting here during this little chat with Jesus. And so Peter says something in 2 Peter that I think is interesting and that I think applies here. He says, first of all, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming that he promised? Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. So nothing's really changed. Nothing ever really does change. Where is this coming of the Christ that everyone keeps talking about? Hasn't happened. All right. Well, we're going to address this morning, and I think that things are changing. Things are not at all going on like they have since the beginning of creation. So we're also going to think about this idea of birth pangs that Jesus brings up in this passage. And so we're going to reread some of the verses to get to where we need to get to this morning. So we're going to start back in verse 3, and it says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pangs. All right. So, many of us have had at least limited experience with childbirth. So we've either experienced it or been in the room with someone who was experiencing it. And so birth pangs, right? Labor, false labor, contractions, they can go on for a really long time and they hurt, right? And the way that you can tell that true labor has begun is that the birth pangs begin to intensify. They get closer and closer together. And so more intensity, more frequency, all that tells you that the birth is getting closer. And so if you're not at the hospital, then you should get there. All right. So, and it seems like what Jesus is saying is that these commonplace events like wars and famines and earthquakes, which happen all the time, are going to start happening at a greater intensity and a greater frequency. That's going to be a signal that the birth is approaching. And then he adds to this, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all the nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. So there's all this warning about false teaching and false teachers and religious BS that's going to like sweep people in the wrong direction, right? And so because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of most will grow cold, but he who stands firm to the end will be rescued. So verse 12 actually sounds a little bit like scary, a little bit weird. Lawlessness is animos, nomos is law. All right. And so animos is like an ideology of no law. And so there's like no moral norms anymore. And so the whole concept of a moral right and wrong is just kind of thrown out. And so the notion that morality is a cultural creation, it's a pretty popular idea these days. And it seems like we're headed towards morality just being obsolete. That's what this verse is talking about. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So in the verses that we just read, Jesus is like scanning through a number of these signs, and they'll apparently intensify and become more frequent as we approach the end of things. And it's right at this point that he brings up what we studied last time. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand that's the beast and the Antichrist. All right. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Then there will be a great tribulation, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. So that's sort of your sequence of things that includes the preaching of the gospel to every nation in the world. And it's directly associated with these last days or this great tribulation. And I think it's interesting to break this down a little bit. So there's like 25 or 30 distinct signs if you put together a few of these prophetic passages that are all about these last days, and you can kind of break them down into like 5 different categories. One is that there's certain sociological features that will be present as we head into the end times. One of those pangs that's mentioned is war. And so this is one of mankind's favorite pastimes throughout our history. So there's never really been a time on earth when there were not scores of wars going on. And that's just as true today as it has ever been. And so on the other hand, though, if you look at the history of war, modern war has taken the idea of war to a whole new level. Okay, so we now have such things as world wars. Okay, that's a fairly new thing, and it started in the 20th century. And so you could never have a world war before because it took so long to get people from one continent to another. And so in modernity, transport's pretty rapid, and so it's possible for war to span the entire globe. People called World War I the war to end all wars. And it did. We've had no trouble at all since then. All right. 11 million battlefield deaths in World War I. World War II had 23 million combat-related deaths. So that's death on a level that the world has never seen, and actually hasn't seen since World War II. But the worst thing is that these are like warm-ups for the main event. If we had another world war today, it would most likely make World War I and World War II look like they weren't that big a deal. With the advent of nuclear and biological weapons, war has moved into a realm that has been unimaginable up until this point. So I actually think that this particular sign could be at hand. This could ramp up to biblical descriptions and proportions at any moment. Okay, the capacity and the capabilities are there. There may not be any proliferation of war at the moment, but our ability to wage war on a far more intense level is already there. So he also mentions this lawlessness in verse 12. Because of the increase in lawlessness, most people's love will grow cold. It's a little bit hard to say, really. Okay, you can't even really be sure what he's talking about exactly. People have always been pretty lawless. People have always broken the moral laws, right? Like in no place or time has everybody followed all the law. And so I think that this is talking about something that's a step beyond that. It's not just that people don't do what they know is right. It's that they deny the existence of such a thing as right. And so that would be a new development. All right. And because that's not how it's been in the past. And it's exactly where we are in our day and age. I think we're smack dab in the middle of like the postmodern denial of all moral norms. And when that happens, as it has most certainly, like today, close relationships become kind of dangerous. And so to have any real closeness in relationship, you and the people that you're relating to need to be under a certain level of moral restraint. Okay, that's what makes it relatively safe to get in there with people, and to be vulnerable with them. And so in like a lawless or an anarchical situation, people are required to keep everyone else at arm's length. You have to protect yourself by keeping relationships pretty shallow. Like being Facebook friends is cool, but to get really close and experience real love between people becomes increasingly unlikely in this situation because there's just too much at risk. Okay, nobody follows the rules. And so I'm not sure exactly what it would take to say that this sign is at hand. Okay, but I think that you could say that this sign is at hand. This is a pretty new development under the postmodern way of looking at the world. So we haven't really seen anything like this in history before, where people are actually denying the existence of right and wrong. And is it true that people's love is growing cold in our culture today? So it's a little bit interesting that in the West, not only is marriage failing, like we've studied a couple of times before, but like increasingly, people are unwilling to even try marriage. So people are so cynical about the chances of marriage succeeding that it's easier to just live with people or not live with anybody and just sleep around. And that's a pretty menacing cultural development, right? The majority of urban children are no longer raised in what could be called a conventional family. And there's a lot of sociological research that shows that this is a huge risk factor in the development of children. They're missing the opportunity to grow up in a secure environment that's created by a traditional family. And so the traditional family is just about history at this point. It's the minority of groupings today that can be considered the traditional family. All right. Most kids grow up in something other than that. And so it was like almost 20 years ago that we crossed that particular threshold. So now what we have is like serial marriages, or, you have this huge percentage of people that never even get married. They just have children with the person that they're living with, and the person that they live with periodically changes. Okay. And so relationally speaking, it's a pretty perilous place, and it makes perfect sense that people's love would grow cold in that kind of situation. And so I think that you can make a decent case for this one being at hand. So most older people will tell you that this has changed right in front of their eyes. So things are just different now than they were, not that long ago. And it's pretty noticeable for the people that have had the time to watch this happen. So this will probably get a lot worse, but we're headed in a direction that leads down this exact path. All right, so there's also certain theological signs that are mentioned here. One of them's pretty clear. Right there in verse 14, it said that the gospel will be preached in every nation as a witness, and then the end shall come. So it's kind of an interesting prediction. When Jesus said this, there were just 12 guys sitting on a hillside. Okay. And Jesus is telling them that what he is teaching them is going to go to every nation on earth. And that really has happened, okay, in the years since then. And so if you count like pseudo Christianity and things that are based on Christianity, it's by far the predominant religion in the world. Unfortunately, most of that number is what I would claim is a pseudo Christianity, but you still have to see that the spread of the basic message has been pretty amazing. And so there's no way to say that it's not a worldwide faith that we're talking about. People used to consider Christianity a Western and a Western European type thing. So it's a little bit difficult to say, I mean, listen, that's just not true anymore. Okay. The majority of Christians are in the developing world. All right. And that's where all of the growth is happening. And so the typical Christian of the planet is no longer white or European. Okay. So I don't know what it looks like to say that this is fulfilled. The Greek expression here that's translated as to all the nations means to all the peoples. And so does that mean nation states or like ethnic linguistic groups within nations? And so within some nations, there are lots of these little subgroups. So like India, there are hundreds of different peoples that have distinct languages and cultures. And there are, many other nations that are like that as well. And so most missiologists assume that it is these groups that this passage is talking about. All right. Because if this just means nations, then we're already there and we've been there for a long time. All right. Every nation on earth has a witnessing and growing Christian church. All right. However, there really are still, linguistic subgroups, cultures that don't have a group of Christians among them. In the early 70s, there were still like 25,000 unreached linguistic subgroups. Okay. Now there are more like 6,000 or 7,000. Okay. So making progress. Whichever way you interpret this passage, this one is either already here or it will be before too long. This is pretty close. Okay. We're going to put a check mark on it. So 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul mentions the great apostasy. That's when the so-called church kind of falls away. Same thing that Jesus refers to when he says that many will deny the faith. These are supposedly believers or followers of God that are carried away by all of the false teachers and the false prophets that come, and they wind up denying their own faith. All right. Well, false teaching has had a pretty prominent place in the history of the church. It's just as prominent today as it ever was in the past. There are huge segments of people that call themselves Christians, but they do not believe that knowing Christ is a matter of faith or on the basis of the grace of God. Okay. And so they think that you have to work your way to heaven. And so we also have denominations that are made up of millions and millions of people where the leaders of those denominations do not believe the Bible. And some of them don't even believe in God. Okay. And yet they continue to operate as churches. So why would they do that? Right? Why would you pick a career as some sort of a clergyman if you do not believe in God? Well, it's because it's a pretty good job. That's why it's not a bad living for a lot of these guys. And so a lot of them started out as believers, but there are more than a few mainstream seminaries today that can strip your faith right away from you. Okay, so something like 90% of the mainline denominations today have preachers that when you ask the question, do you believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, will answer no. All right, so that's 90% of the leadership in mainstream denominations today. It's pretty bad. So we could study this for a while, but we're not gonna. We're gonna move on and put a check mark on it. I don't know what it would take to call this one done, but things are pretty bad at the moment. All right, so like this could be fulfilled at this moment for all we know. I don't know. So there's also some ecological signs that Jesus mentions in his little list. The one that we went through last week, was it last week? Overpopulation. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I know, dude. We spent a few minutes looking at this growth chart, right, of the human population. We noticed that it wasn't until 1830 that we reached the first billion people on the planet. And since then, it has soared to where we are today, right? 8 billion people as of in between when I said we were close and right now. So it's headed, straight on up to 9 or 10 billion in the next few decades. So this is what's driving a lot of the other ecological signs that the Bible gives us. And so think of that verse that Peter wrote. Where is this sign of his coming? Ever since the fathers fell asleep, everything stays the same as it ever was. Not this, man. Okay, this is not the same as it always was. So this sign is there. All right, it may get worse, but it's not going to take very long. Jesus also mentions famines, like the birth pangs of a woman in labor. And so tragically, we can anticipate more of this than we're already seeing, but we're already witnessing some of this. And so how many people do you suppose died of malnutrition and hunger last year worldwide? All right, like so the Mercy Corps says that it's at least 9 million people every year. The World Food Congress claims closer to 50 million. Okay, so the truth is probably somewhere in between those numbers, but it's a huge number either way. Okay, it doesn't make any difference that those numbers are really different. They're all big. That number dwarfs anything that you could have said in any previous century. It's an entirely modern phenomenon to have that many people starving to death. Okay, the real problems are still mostly in the future. So, I mentioned one report last week that said that like 20 million people face starvation in a segment of Africa, right? Like in the immediate future. That's a lot of people in one little section. Okay, so the promise is that this is going to get worse than it currently is. So the birth pangs of famine are going to sweep this planet, I'm afraid, and we're right on the edge of it. And with us using our grain to make alcohol for our cars, all right, like we're just making this worse. Okay, so it's not fully developed, I don't think, but this one's at hand, gets check mark. So pestilence is mentioned in a bunch of these passages. Revelation refers to it as the ashen horse. Plague and pestilence. All right. So in Luke's version of the Olivet discourse, Jesus talks about it too. Not in Matthew's though. Pestilence means disease. All right. And this is all like kind of a little bit surprising in a certain sense. In the 50s and 60s, modern people had decided that humanity had conquered disease, right? Like we killed smallpox, measles was headed out. They were pretty sure that the, power of modern science would sweep away disease entirely. We have made some progress, right? Like it's no coincidence that the human lifespan has gone from 35 to 75 years in the West. That's modern science. Okay, that's good. And yet the Bible says that things don't go on that way. And so just when we think that we've conquered all of these things, this horrible pestilence is going to like take us out. And so I have no idea if we can say that this is underway or happening now or what. We certainly do not have a handle on cancer, okay, or really even AIDS in the developing world. You know, COVID-19 has certainly done a number on us in the last couple of years in a lot of different ways. And, you know, do some reading on like antibiotic resistant bacteria and parasites or superbugs. Okay, these are huge threats. So we certainly have the bugs to unleash all sorts of disease related disasters. So we'll see. I don't know what this looks like. Also mentioned seismic activity, right? Earthquakes. It would be pretty easy to pull up a bunch of headlines, put them on the screen, jump to some conclusions, but I'm not gonna. This is a pretty hard one actually to make a call on. So we have seismic data for 5 consecutive 20-year periods. And it's true that this last period has seen more seismic activity than the previous 4. But in like geological terms, right, 100 years is a ridiculously small amount of time. And so we basically have nothing that is enough to draw any conclusions at all on. And so I have a feeling that this one's going to be a lot more obvious than what we're currently looking at. And so we're just going to leave it a question mark. I think that when the earthquakes ramp up, we're going to know it. All right. So there's also a geopolitical scenario that the Bible lays out that needs to be in place before this great tribulation thing can go down. Several distinct things that need to be there. We did the first one a couple of weeks ago. It's the regathering of the Jewish people into the nation of Israel. So this is an essential component, and it was one of the least likely things to actually happen. Okay. And yet it's one of the most obvious that it actually has happened. So after 2,000 years and against all odds, they have reformed their nation and retaken Jerusalem, just as exactly as Jesus said they would. Last week, we looked at this concept of one worldism. So before the Great Tribulation can happen, there has to be a higher level of integration in the nations of the world. So people are going to have to form some sort of like international organization that resembles a one world government. And last week we argued that the foundation for that has been laid. And so in our global economy today, through the internet and through the universal adoption of English and other factors, the world stands at a level of integration today that's unlike anything that history has ever seen. And so this area has some major movement just in the last 20 years. And so most of these factors have really come into play pretty recently, you know, from a historical sense. I think that this is on the edge of being obviously at hand. This is going to build very rapidly from where it stands right now. I think things change pretty quickly under modern conditions, and we pretty much just accept it or take it for granted or whatever. All right, this one's interesting, I think. The Bible says that Europe is going to experience something similar to what Israel experienced. And so just as Israel was regathered and reformed, the Roman Empire is going to be regathered and reformed into a single European nation again. All right, Daniel and Revelation both say this. So last week I briefly described that I think that this mortal head wound of the beast is that the Roman Empire disappears, and then the healing of the head wound is that it reappears. And so it's clear, excuse me, wow. And so it's clear from the passages about this that we're not really talking about the specific geographical area of Rome or the name Rome. Okay, it's the people and the culture of Rome that's being talked about. They're going to be regathered at the end times, and it's specifically spoken of as a coalition of nations. And then subsequently, this is the group out of which the beast emerges. So it was not very long ago that the suggestion that the French, and the Germans and the Italians would come together to form a single nation was pretty preposterous. Okay, it was unthinkable. But if you take a look over there now, right, that's exactly where we're headed. There was a treaty in 1992 that says that their intent is to become the United States of Europe. Okay, they already use the same currency. Okay, this has all happened in our lifetime. We're not even really paying attention. And so if you went to Europe anytime up through the 80s, you would have to sit for an hour to cross any border. All right, I never actually experienced that. You have to go through customs, like international travel, every time you cross one of these little borders. I've been to Europe half a dozen times since the mid 90s. And, you know, there's just a sign when you cross the border. It's like, welcome to Indiana. Okay. It's like driving from Florida to Georgia. It makes no difference at all which country you're in. They've stalled a little bit in their unification over having a European constitution. They can't seem to agree on a few things, but they'll work it out. Okay. It has always been this way. They ease forward some and then they take a step back, but the progress is always towards unification. Bible teachers have been predicting this for a very long time, even when it seemed like it wasn't even plausible. All right. But we're on the cusp of this, I would say, and it's totally normal for us. Okay. It's just like we think that, of course, that's the way it is. Europe is going to become a single nation. The progress is intermittent, but it's headed that direction. I think I have a check mark. Yeah. All right. So it's obviously not finished. Okay. But we will see it. Okay. It's almost there. It's like 3/4. They've got their own parliament. They have a president. The Bible says they're going to finish this up. So I bet they do. The Bible also talks about a great Eastern power. Okay, refers to the kings of the East. So really the only thing that we know about this power is that they live in the East. Okay, that's east of the Middle East. All right, this is written in the Middle East, so east of there. And we know that they're very numerous. So this is the power in Revelation 9 that with their entry into the campaign of Armageddon, the number 200 million pops up that we talked about, okay, for the number of combatants. This is a very numerous army. They're also the one that is first attributed with the slaughter of 1/3 of the human race. So this is likely a nuclear power, although this could be biological. I actually think nuclear fits the description better. We'll get to that in a minute. So we have a very numerous nation that is east of the Middle East and is a nuclear power. All right. Today, we got more than one country that fits that description. Okay. China and India easily fit that description. So they get a check mark. For all we know, this power is already there. We don't know which one it is, but all of the qualifications are met for this to be there. The final political sign that we're given is this coming of the beast. So this is the guy that shows up at the center of this scenario, and he's able to get the allegiance of all the power blocks of the world for a brief, like 3.5-year period of time. But there is world peace under a single government for that time. All right. We don't clearly see the beast today, but you never know. All right. He may already be alive. He could be growing up right now. He could be coming into adulthood right under our noses. You know, you never know. He could just be waiting for his time of power, but we can't tell it's him yet. I don't know. All right. We're just going to leave this one with a question mark until it becomes more clear. So we touched on some technological signs last week. We saw that there has to be a fiscal control system that spans the entire world, and that would require like a vast network of computer controls. Okay, just like what we have today. Okay. So we looked at a passage that had the entire world watching the same incident at the same time. It was very explicit on that point, and the whole incident was only 3 days long. So there was no travel involved, and everybody watches it together. We certainly have the ability to do that today. And in order to do all that, you would need satellites to get all of the info all over the world. Done. All right, we got that covered. This entire picture is at hand. And so this morning, we're going to throw down another one of these that I glossed over last week. We're going to go through the suggestion that nuclear weapons are referred to in these predictive passages. They certainly don't call them that. Okay, but where we are in Matthew this morning, he says, then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. And unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days shall be cut short. And the context of this is war. Okay, he's not saying that there will be so many earthquakes that everyone would die. It's this war that's the context of this last great tribulation. And so we're going to look at a couple of Old Testament passages that are about this same thing. The first one is Isaiah 24. It says, the earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. And so if you go down to verse 21, you'll see that the context for this whole discussion are the last days. It's the judgment day of God, where he reasserts his authority, and this is happening right before that. And so according to Jesus, God himself has to intervene in order to keep humanity from annihilating ourselves. Then in verse 19, we read that the earth is broken up. The earth is split asunder. The earth is thoroughly shaken. And so they're referring to this like an earthquake. And this kind of thing comes up over and over again in these passages. And this is an earthquake that is unlike anything that has happened before. So many scholars believe that these prophets that are writing this stuff down like see a vision. Okay. And the vision is like them watching a movie a little bit of events that happen in the future. And then they go and they try to write down what they saw. And so in several of the books, this is pretty explicit. Okay. The prophet says that he saw this thing. And so he wrote it down. Revelation is just that way. And so this would be ancient people who have never seen any kind of explosion before. Okay. They know nothing of gunpowder. They've never seen a gun or a bomb. They know what fire is. All right. And they could throw burning jars of naphtha at one another. Okay. That's as close as they got. But how would an ancient man describe a movie that they saw of modern warfare? Right. So maybe they see everything shaking, things falling down, and the only language that they have to describe it is like an earthquake. Okay. Because everything's falling down. The earth reels like a drunkard. It sways like a hut in the wind. So heavy upon it is the guilt of its rebellion that it falls, never to rise again. This one's from chapter 13. It says, a sound of tumult on the mountains, like that of many people, a sound of the uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. And so you can see that this is a battle that he's talking about. They're coming from a far country, from the farthest horizons, the Lord and his instruments of indignation to destroy the whole land. Therefore, all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt. They will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Okay, so like many of these people, many of these accounts talk about people being burned to death. All right. And that was not really normal in ancient warfare. You would die from a club, okay, or a blade, but not very often from fire. In modern warfare, lots of people burn. Okay. So it will make mortal man scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. And so that sounds almost just like what Jesus said. Okay. And so if you were to be walking along and stumble across a gold nugget on the ground, that's how likely it would be to find a living human being at this point, at least in this area. So Zechariah has one that's kind of freaky. And again, the context is the last days. And he says, "For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle." And I'm skipping a few verses for the sake of time, but you should go back and read them yourself. This is the plague with which the Lord will strike all the nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. So that sounds a little gruesome, but really, when you die, of course your flesh is going to rot. Okay. Where else would your eyes rot but in their eye sockets? Okay. And so in some ways, this is not really that extraordinary. Okay. Except that it says while they're standing on their feet. And so now this is a completely unknown thing to happen in the ancient world. Okay. But we could guess what this might be. Okay. And I'm not just talking about the fact that we've all seen that last scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Okay. We have actual accounts that sound just like this that have come out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's almost exactly how it was described to be anywhere near a nuclear blast. And so this is almost undoubtedly a description of the detonation of nuclear weapons, in my opinion. All right, so we're going to look at Revelation again, and we're going to think about some more of this language where the author's describing things that he sees in the future in the language of his own day with words that he has access to. Okay. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. All right. So what is a mountain burning with fire? Sounds kind of like a volcano. They knew what volcanoes were. That's a little bit like an explosion sometimes. So this would be like the closest thing that they had ever heard of to an explosion. But he didn't say it was a volcano. He said that it was something like a mountain burning with fire. It's something similar to that. And when that happens, a third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. He may be watching a future naval battle, right? Potentially with nuclear weapons. And so this goes on. It says, a third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star blazing like a torch fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. So wormwood is a term that they would use for poison. Okay, it just means poison. So this would be like an asteroid or a meteor, but it would have to be a poison meteor. Okay, so that's possible. But it seems more likely that the radiation from nuclear battle would poison the water. And these guys have never really seen anything fall from the sky before other than meteorites or something like that. Okay, and he's describing a blazing torch falling from the sky. Okay. It's not a bad description of what a missile would look like. I don't know. Okay. But what else would he call it? He wouldn't call it a missile. Okay. So, like I said, I think these guys are doing the best that they can to describe the things that they're seeing with language that they have. And my clicker. There we go. All right, so back in verse 7, it says, the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood. It was hurled down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up. A third of the trees were burned up. All the green grass was burning up. Okay, so John is seeing all this, and he's trying to describe, this and the mountain, a burning mountain thrown into the ocean, but hail doesn't really burn. Okay. This is most likely not a hailstorm. Hailstorm wouldn't burn the earth very much. All right. This clicker's killing me. Okay. So maybe he saw something like this and couldn't come up with any other way to describe it. We'll just keep reading, see what it sounds like. Burning mountain thrown into the ocean. All right. So this is Revelation 16. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. So there's no question about what's going on in this passage. This is the last war of the world. So Armageddon's a valley in northern Israel. This is where the war concentrates. There's war all over the place, but the focus of this is in the Middle East. Check out this description. Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since man has been on earth. So tremendous was the quake. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. From the sky, huge hailstones of about 100 pounds each fell upon men, and they cursed God on account of the plague of hail, because the plague was so terrible. So I suppose with God involved, there could be 100-pound hailstones falling all over the place. Okay, but in this context of this great battle, and given the assumption that this guy's describing things that he's never seen before, I would say that this is likely something besides hail, okay, that's raining down on the battlefield. So this part doesn't sound like nuclear weapons to me. But have you ever seen what happens on the ground when an A-10 lets loose with the largest Gatling gun ever put into military service, right? With depleted uranium projectiles. So 100-pound hailstones, okay, the results could accurately be described as 100-pound hailstones falling from the sky. And if you watch videos of this kind of thing, I do, especially in slow motions, right? Each round hits, it looks like it's raining fire. Okay, so I don't know. Maybe. How about the C-130 gunships? Hercules, Spectre. You guys know what I'm talking about? Puff the Magic Dragon. Unbelievable in the amount of damage that we can do on the ground. Okay, so this airplane has 25 millimeter Gatling guns and 105 millimeter semi-automatic side-mounted cannons that are supposed to be aimed at the ground. Okay, bring the rain, right? It's exactly what 100-pound hailstones would do. And so an ancient guy that's never seen anything fall from the sky in his entire life, okay, except maybe hailstones. So everything that falls from the sky and destroys things is a hailstone. And so I think that this whole thing's describing modern combat, all right, modern warfare with air support and with small nuclear explosions. These are not the only passages that talk about this. All right, but we're not going to do any more of them because I get too excited with the, airplanes and guns and stuff. But we have to get done with this passage eventually. All right, so I think that you can make the case that nuclear weapons are described in enough detail to identify them. And I think that that's what Jesus is talking about when he says that all life on earth would end if God didn't stop things. So we certainly can do that now. And that has never, ever been possible before our current era. Okay, everything remains the same as it ever was ever since the foundations of the earth. is what Peter said. I don't think so. Not now, not anymore. Did stay the same for a really long time. So none of these things on this list have ever been possible before. They're all just now. Okay. In our lifetime, some of them possible. One generation ago, this list has like one check mark on it, if any. See what I mean? And so let's read some more of Matthew. It says, so if anyone tells you, there he is out in the desert, do not go out, or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. So that's a bit cryptic. But if you compare this with Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, you'll see that this statement is in response to one of them asking, where is this going to happen? And so this last verse is his response. It sounds like he's just saying that it'll be wherever the center of the action is, right? Like wherever this is going on is where this is going to happen. And then he says, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And so maybe this is again language that has to do with perspective. So from the perspective of the surface of the earth, it's going to look like these things have darkened, maybe from smoke or debris in the atmosphere. Then again, maybe it's literal. I don't know. A big asteroid or a volcano or explosion would explain this stuff. I don't know. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his people from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. So it sounds like he's describing the rescue of the people of God, or the rapture. This is where believers are yanked out of there so that they don't have to endure the fate of the rest of the world. Then in verse 32, he says, now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. So he's talking about the signs of the times. You're supposed to learn to recognize them, just like you can tell that spring is coming. Okay. And then he says, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. And so lots of people pull this one up to show that Jesus blew it. All right. He thought that this was all going to happen to the people he was talking to, and it still hasn't happened yet. All right. But that's not how I read this. Okay. When I read this generation, you have to ask which generation he's talking about. Okay. In the context, it's the generation that sees all these things. And so, in other words, when you see these things happening, it's not going to be like another 500 years. Okay. It's that generation that should know that they are the ones. And so we're not really seeing these birth pangs. The wars haven't really ramped up, but the stage is completely set. Okay. And then he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Jesus is putting his own words on the same level as scripture. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So anyone that starts to set up a date for the end times is blowing smoke. Okay. Nobody knows the answer to this, but we should have a sense of the general time, like just like the first coming. Okay. They should have been expecting it. They had the signs. In fact, they were expecting it. So we also have the signs. That's what Jesus is talking about here with that little parable of the fig tree. And so when we see the signs, we should have a sense for what's coming. will know the general time, but not the day or the hour. Then he says, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That's how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. So there's a part of that story of Noah that's pretty sobering. Okay, so Noah spent all those years building a boat in the middle of the desert. Everybody thought he was a complete idiot, okay, a crazy person. There's a 3-story tall gangplank that went up into this ship. All right, there's no rigging to close the gangplank. Okay, but that's how they loaded the ship. And when Noah entered the ark, it says that God closed the door. All right, God didn't leave the choice to Noah. Once the door is closed, it's impossible to get into the ark. And so one moment it's open and all are welcome. And the next moment it's slammed shut and the chance is gone. All right, that's the way it's going to be at the coming of the Son of Man. And the people around Noah were just engaged in eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. Nothing wrong with any of that stuff. It's just that people were so preoccupied fussing about the day-to-day of life that they never stopped to think about what was happening around them. So history is going somewhere, and people just spend their lives oblivious to that. All right, 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill, one will be taken, and the other left. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. So if it's hard to say if he's talking about the rapture or if he's still in the context of the Noah thing. Either way, some people are saved and some are not. That's the point. Then he says, but understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let the house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. And this is really the point of the entire discussion. You need to be ready for the coming of the Son of Man. I'm going to read a passage in 1 Thessalonians real quick. It's on the same subject. Chapter 5. It says, now as to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. Sounds a little bit like Paul has been reading Matthew 24. While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. But check this part out. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day would overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night nor of darkness. Because God has given us the signs, all right, so that we can see this coming. We should have some sense that things are building, okay? It's not supposed to be a surprise for everyone. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober. And so this is one of the applications that we should be taking away from all of this. And so if you're here today and you're a believer, then this is no time for apathy and slumber. The last days will be an astonishing time to be alive. Okay, events are going to move quickly. You should probably be alert and paying attention. For those who sleep, do their sleeping at night. Those who get drunk at night. All right, so sleeping and drunkenness are both suggestive of people being zoned out. All right, not paying attention. We're not supposed to be not paying attention. But since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the anticipation of rescue. I switched the word hope for the word anticipation because that's really what it means. For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining rescue through our Lord Jesus Christ. Well, we knew that already. We're not under the wrath of God. Jesus Christ, who died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, dead, we will live together with him. That is an incredibly bold claim, that the death of Jesus makes it possible for us to live no matter what happens. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone that comes to me will live, even if he dies. He also says that anyone who believes in him will never die. Right? Eternal life, ultimate safety comes from a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. The death of Christ was not just some tragic event. It was a coming that had a purpose, and that was to pay the price for human sin so that we could get back into a relationship with God. All right? And you kind of have to wonder, what if that claim is true? What if we can get into a relationship with God through the death of Jesus Christ? That would be the most important information that you will ever encounter. And one of the reasons for believing that this claim is true is this huge volume of accurate and fulfilled predictive prophecy. The passages that we read today describe the world that we live in with unbelievable detail and accuracy. And it is a completely different world than any that have ever existed before it. All right. And yet there it is on the pages of the Bible. And so we blasted through these passages this morning. You should take a class or study them for yourself. There are hundreds of passages to put together here. Okay. And you should start out skeptical. But if you're at all interested in the truth, ask God to guide you and go looking for it yourself. Okay. Don't take my word on any of this. And so from any and all the research that I've done, this is mind-boggling how accurate these predictions are. All right. This is a detailed picture of a future world that, you couldn't accidentally happen upon in a dream. There's no way. Okay. And we're just going to have to settle for that this morning, I'm afraid. That's what I got. Whether or not any of these speculative conclusions that we talked about this morning or last week are correct, the main point is pretty clear. Okay, the Bible does give us this one-of-a-kind predictive scenario that does cover the entire scope of human history. All right, and that includes our own day. That's important, right? Like that it includes us in this history that it lays out. But where we're at now is the stage for the end of history. And I think it's compelling enough to take a look at it and to believe, that when you pick up the Bible, we're picking up a supernatural book. It's not a normal book. It's the Word of God. No one else could pull this off. All right. And so that's where we're going to land this morning. We'll get back into some parables next week. Jesus is going to tell some stories that illustrate what it looks like to be ready for this stuff that he's talking about is happening in the future.